A contract that bound her to a mysterious man, surrounded by shadows and secrets, someone who had never known the touch of a woman. But what happened next? No one could have ever imagined. If this story touches your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments. Where are you listening from? Your support is what keeps stories like this alive. She had always known the hush of early mornings in the valley, the way mist rose like a prayer from the river, the way roosters announced the day before the light could fully claim it. Isabel Hart learned to listen to the language of small things, the creak of old floorboards, the way the wind tested the windows, the smell of coffee drifting from a dented kettle, the wood smoke that lived in her father's sweaters. Their little house, set on the edge of a thinning orchard, had a heartbeat she could feel if she pressed her palm to the kitchen wall. On most days, that heartbeat calmed her. On this day, it made her feel like the house was afraid. Morning broke blue and brittle. Frost clung to the weeds like secrets, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The metal click of the front gate, the thump of boots on the porch. Her father's breath catching in his chest, as though breathing itself were now an act he had to negotiate. She had seen Thomas Hart pace before, but never like this. Hands on hips, lips moving with figures only he could see, a tattered ledger under his arm like a wound he refused to show. "Papa?" she asked, pouring coffee into two mismatched cups. "Come sit. It's too early to wear the floor out." He looked smaller in that moment, as if the night had shaved inches from his frame. "We have visitors," he said. "Not the kind that accepts coffee." Isabel's fingers tightened around the cup. She remembered the envelope from last week. Thick, beige, smelling faintly of cologne and trouble. She had found it wedged in their mailbox, her name spelled wrong on the front. Her father's debt spelled perfectly on the inside, numbers that didn't feel real, dates that stalked the page like wolves. "Visitors," she echoed, setting the cups down. Gerald Turner. Thomas's jaw worked. He had a good man's eyes, soft even when wet with worry, but now they were glassy, as if a film of shame had grown there. Him. And men. There are footsteps a person recognizes by the way they disrespect the ground. Before Isabel could answer, the door opened without a knock, bringing a rush of wind that smelled of gasoline and rain. A tall man stepped inside with the authority of someone who'd been granted permission by the law, or the kind of money that thinks it is the law. Gerald Turner filled the doorway like a verdict. Immaculate coat, practical shoes that took dust without keeping it, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Hart," he said, as if he were greeting a guest at a gala, not a daughter in a narrow kitchen. Two men followed him, silent and large, their faces unlit by anything resembling curiosity. They did not look at the table, or the chipped blue bowl, or the framed photograph of Isabel's mother gone 10 years. They looked at corners as if danger lurked there, when the danger had already entered and was now hanging his coat on their chair. Thomas moved first, pulling out a chair. "Mr. Turner, you said today. I didn't expect—" He trailed off, glancing at the men who had decided the kitchen was too small to bother with. "I like punctuality," Turner said, sitting with a tempered grace. He clasped his hands. His knuckles were pale, the kind that had never known an honest blister. "It saves everyone from unnecessary theatre." Isabel took in the details. The neatly trimmed nails, the pressed shirt that whispered when he leaned forward, the scent of something antiseptic clinging to him. The opposite of their house, which had the warm human scent of a place where life got on with it, despite every reason to stop. "We have been trying," Thomas began. Turner lifted a hand, and Thomas fell silent. "Let's be plain. You owe a sum that cannot be hidden in the couch cushions, Mr. Hart. Interest is a hungry creature. It prefers meat to promises." He slid a folder onto the table and tapped it. "I am not without mercy. I am here with an option that extends beyond the graceless ritual of taking your house and your land and leaving you to sleep under the trees you once owned." Isabel's stomach knotted. Mercy. Options. Words braided to look like rope, and they were supposed to hold on. "What option?" she asked, her own voice steadier than she felt. The two men by the door shifted their weight as if surprised she'd spoken. Turner's gaze found her again, and something like amusement passed through it. "You are the option, Miss Hart." The kitchen chilled a degree. The kettle on the stovetop clicked as it cooled. Isabel felt the whole room tilt, though nothing moved. She kept her face smooth. "How convenient," she said, and was proud her voice did not crack. Turner's smile tightened, as if he appreciated a certain courage in his entertainment. "A marriage," he said, "to a man I represent. He is, how shall I put it, discerning. He dislikes the noise of society and has no use for its hollow pageants. He lives well, he will keep you better. Your father's debt will vanish, including the interest you don't yet know is sharpening its teeth." The word marriage fell into the room like a heavy book whose spine no one had the strength to read. Isabel's mind widened to the thought of it, then narrowed again in self-defense. She heard the wind press its forehead against the window. She saw the shadow of a bird cross the table. Somewhere in the orchard, a branch snapped, small and final. "What does he want?" she asked, because this was the seam that mattered. It wasn't a question about dowry or vows or rings. It was about the shape of her life after saying yes. Turner looked pleased. He wants peace. He wants privacy. He wants a wife who understands silence. He wants a household run without waste or drama. He seeks no theatrics. Doom, a glance at the photograph on the wall, as if to say he noticed their dead, but they were beside the point. In return, he offers you a life without fear of eviction notices or knives slipped between the ribs of those you love. The two men by the door said nothing, but Turner's use of knives made the air taste like metal. "Who is he?" Thomas asked, finally recovering the courage fathers hoard for moments like this. There was something desperate in the way he clung to formality, as if getting the right name might undo the wrongness of it all. Turner rested his palms on the folder. Damien Rowe. The name carried weight, even out here. There were rumors in town. A sprawling business empire, a mansion beyond the ridge where the road turned from asphalt to silence. A man whose fortune had been stacked brick by brick atop an iron discipline that left no room for softness. Some said he was cruel, some said he was simply exact, all agreed he was not to be crossed. Isabel felt a twitch in her chest, not fear, not curiosity, something else that would name itself later, Damien Rowe. She rolled the syllables quietly in her mind, as one might test a pebble's smoothness with the tongue. "And why," she asked softly, "would a man like that look to you to find him a wife?" Turner's smile didn't change, but his eyes cooled, as if she had asked a personal question in a public place. "Because I have the reach to find what he requires. Because I can see the shape of a problem and the elegance of its solution." "And what shape am I?" she asked. His gaze moved over her face without lingering longer than necessary. "You are lovely," he said, as if complimenting a painting, "but not reckless. You are intelligent enough to understand the terms of a contract and compassionate enough to keep a household from becoming a museum. You have roots. Men like him need roots." Isabel had spent years tending to things that would never bloom again. Her father's hope, the tired trees, the cracked steps nobody would pay to fix. She was good at coaxing life from whatever wasn't fully dead. The compliment, such as it was, sat strangely between flattery and procurement. She lifted her chin. "What happens if I say no?" Turner opened the folder and slid a single page toward her. It was a statement, dense with numbers and the tidy cruelty of interest compounded. "Then your father loses everything," he said in the bland tone of a weather report. "He goes where men go when they cannot pay, into a grinder that chews them until they look like everybody else. I collect your home, and he learns the cold edges of charity." A slight shrug. "He is not a young man. The winter will not be kind. Thomas made a sound, half protest, half shame. Isabel reached for his hand under the table. His skin felt like paper warmed by the sun. "Mr. Turner," Thomas said, voice shaking, "I made this mess. She is not. She should not." Turner's expression suggested he had heard this scene before, many times, and it bored him. "I am not a villain, Mr. Hart. I am giving you a door that does not slam. Walk through it." The wind lifted the corner of a placemat. Isabel watched it rise and fall, as if breathing. Somewhere behind Turner's measured voice and her father's cracked plea, she could hear her mother humming in memory, a tune without words she once used to make the dishwater feel like river water. Life had a way of disguising its choices as inevitabilities. She wanted to be angry, at her father for gambling with wolves, at a stranger for turning her into currency, at herself for measuring the price and finding the arithmetic impossible to deny. "I'd like to see the contract," she said. Turner brightened in that small, efficient way of men whose job is to close. He slid more papers forward. The pages smelled faintly of ink and the ozone scent of newness, the way machines sometimes smell when they are first switched on. Isabel read. She took her time, aware of the two men by the door, committing her patience to memory. The terms were simple and devastating. Marriage within a fortnight, an arrangement of living that emphasized discretion and duty, her father's debts eliminated in full upon the signing and witnessed exchange. There was also a clause, quiet, final, that spoke of privacy so absolute it felt like a second wedding, this one to silence. She lifted her eyes. "And if he is unkind?" Turner's lashes flickered. "He is not unkind," he said, which was not the same as saying he was kind. "He is exacting. He appreciates order. He rewards loyalty." "What does he want from me beyond order and loyalty?" Turner's mouth softened into something that pretended to be sympathy and failed only because it had been practiced. "He wants a wife in name and in presence. He is not a man of appetites. He values restraint. He values peace above fireworks. In many ways, you will find him, how to put this, undemanding." She heard the unsaid things, how they screeched against the page like hidden annotations. Undemanding could mean indifference. Restraint could mean absence. Peace could mean loneliness turned into furniture. Thomas squeezed her fingers under the table. "Isabel, you owe me nothing," he whispered, voice barely audible. "If there is a hell made for men who can't do better by their daughters, I have earned my place. Don't do this for me." She looked at him, and the love she felt was a deep, aching river. He had tried. He had picked late apples until his hands bled sweetness. He had sold tools and pride alike. He had gotten small in a world that admired only the loud and the large, and still it hadn't been enough. There were failures that were crimes and failures that were sorrows. She knew which his was. She turned to Turner. "I want to know one more thing," she said. "Why me? Not the qualities you listed. Why me, Isabel Hart, in this house with these dishes and that photograph on the wall?" Turner considered, then surprised her with an answer that felt honest. "Because someone told me you take care of what is fragile," he said, "and he didn't say Damien's name this time, is not fragile, not in the way people think, but there is something in him that must be handled with clean hands." The room made a new kind of sense, a geometry she had not tried before. She saw herself not as a coin, but as a key, and felt ashamed for the moment of clarity. That shame passed, replaced by a strange quiet. Clean hands. She looked down at her palms, traced by the faint, pale lines left by springs and summers of work. She thought of her mother's voice again, but this time it sounded like a warning turned blessing. The things you give away sometimes return as wings. She picked up the pen. It was heavier than it looked, substantial, like a truth nobody wanted to hear. The paper waited, The men by the door leaned forward a fraction. Turner's breathing changed, a barely there quickening, as if he were standing over a roulette wheel and the ball was about to settle. Her father made a half-sob, half-prayer sound that made her want to walk backward through time and break every fall before it started. Isabel set the pen down deliberately, not on the paper, but beside the cup of cooling coffee. She stood, and the chair groaned like an old friend asked to bear a new weight. She crossed to the sink and washed her hands, not because they were dirty, but because the water was warm and the act felt like an anointing. The soap smelled of lavender and lemons. Somebody had given it to her last Christmas in a basket she'd kept, because throwing away the ribbon would have felt like betrayal. She dried her hands on a towel that had once been a good towel, then turned back to the table. "Papa," she said, and her voice was a note struck true. "Look at me." He did. Through the fog of a man who wanted to stop existing and couldn't, he looked. She picked up the pen again. The metal felt less like judgment, more like a tool. She lowered the tip to the page, then stopped, the slightest distance left between ink and acceptance. She let the pause lengthen until even Turner seemed to feel it. That space where a life could go left or right. Isabel listened to the slow tick of the clock, to the wind impatient at the window, to the ghost of her mother's song, to the steady, tremulous drum under her own ribs. "Onde asino?" she asked softly, still in the language of home, because some words insisted on being born in the place that taught you to speak. Then, in English, clear as water over stone. "Where do I sign?" Turner slid the page closer, his finger marking the line like a path. "Here," he said. She bent toward the paper. For a fraction of a heartbeat, she let herself imagine other versions of this morning. A knock that never came, a debt forgiven by a miracle that preferred other towns, a job that arrived like a lifeline and paid exactly what was owed. Those were not today's options. She placed the tip to the line. Ink claimed the paper, her name blooming like a bruise and a banner at once. Isabel Hart. The letters looked both foreign and inevitable, anchored by a hand that did not tremble until after the last stroke. The house seemed to exhale. Turner's smile was efficient and satisfied. He signaled to one of the men by the door, who stepped forward with a second document that smelled faintly of stricter rooms and colder light. "It will be done as agreed," Turner said, already organizing his exit. "A car will come for you tomorrow to begin preparations. You'll find the arrangement smooth." He glanced at Thomas, whose shoulders had begun to shake with a release that looked a lot like defeat. "Mr. Hart, consider your burdens lifted." Isabel didn't answer. She stood still, the pen a cooling thing in her fingers, the world a room with both doors open to the weather. When Turner and his men left, the wind rushed in to reclaim the scent of them. The door shut with a thud that sounded final, but decisions, she knew, had echoes that went on speaking long after the mouth closed. She crossed to her father, cupped his face in her hands. He tried to speak and failed. She didn't need his words. The ledger lay abandoned on the table, numbers spilling like rain from its pages. She turned it over so the blank cardboard faced up, a small defiance, a mercy for paper and man alike. Outside, the frost began to loosen its grip on the weeds. The orchard stood quiet and modest, as if holding its breath on behalf of the house. Isabel pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the window and watched the road that would soon bring a car she could not afford to refuse. Her reflection looked back at her, steadier than she felt, older than yesterday, a girl stitched to a woman with a single signature. Somewhere beyond the ridge, an estate waited. A mansion with rules and echoing halls, with silence arranged like furniture, with a man named Damien Rowe, who had chosen peace over fireworks, a man she had agreed to meet not by chance, but by necessity. She lifted the pen again and set it upright in the chipped mug beside the stove, as if planting a flag in territory newly claimed. Then she opened the door and stepped onto the porch, into the thin sun. The cold met her like a question she wasn't ready to answer. She pulled her sweater tighter and stared at the road until the wind made her eyes water, until it looked like she was already crying, though the tears had not been granted permission. Somewhere, a car engine turned over, or maybe it was only a tractor in a field, reminding the morning to move. Isabel stood there, listening for the sound that would tell her the next page had arrived, and wondering, without daring to put it into words, what exactly the price of silence would be when it finally asked to be paid. The carriage that came for her was no carriage at all, but a car so polished it seemed to swallow the world into its surface and return it flawless. Isabel had seen cars before, dusty trucks coughing along orchard roads, the occasional gleaming sedan owned by the richer townsfolk, but never anything like this. Its blackness was pure, like the underside of a raven's wing, and when the door opened, the smell wasn't of leather or gasoline, but of order, of wealth, of everything designed to make its passenger feel both smaller and contained. The driver didn't speak. His uniform was without a crease, his gloves pale against the wheel. Isabel gripped the seat as the town slipped away, houses shrinking into dots, the river flattening into a silver thread. Every turn of the road felt like a sentence being written without her consent, a grammar of inevitability leading to only one ending. Her father had stood on the porch as she left, shoulders bent against the cold, his raised hand looking more like an apology than a farewell. She carried that image with her, tucked like a folded letter behind her ribs. For a while she could still see the orchard, rows of brittle trees, guardians of a history already sold. Then it vanished behind a hill, and with it the sound of everything she had ever known. Hours passed. The road climbed, twisting through forests where light fell thin and silvery. Silence filled the car, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of gravel under the tires. Isabel pressed her forehead to the glass, watching the landscape shift from wild to manicured. Trees grew straighter, lawns stretched wider, gates rose taller. Wealth, she realized, left its fingerprints on the land itself. And then she saw it. The mansion stood at the end of a long drive lined with hedges so perfectly trimmed they looked unreal. The building loomed, its pale stone washed in winter light, its windows gleaming like eyes that had seen too much and promised nothing. It was beautiful the way glaciers are beautiful, breathtaking, remote, and capable of crushing. Isabel's chest tightened. This was no house. This was a declaration. The car slowed, its tires whispering over gravel, and stopped before a staircase wide enough for a procession. At the top, the doors loomed, tall, carved, shut with the certainty of never having been forced open. The driver stepped out, opened her door, and gestured. No words, just expectation. Isabel gathered the folds of her modest dress, knew only because Turner's men had insisted, and placed her shoes on the stone. The cold seeped through instantly. Her breath rose in thin clouds against the immensity of the place. The door opened before she could reach it. A woman stood framed in the doorway, rigid as a statue, cloaked in an air of permanence. She was neither young nor old, her face marked by lines carved from control rather than kindness. Her dress was dark, her collar high, her hair pulled back in a knot that allowed not a single strand to escape. "Miss Hart," the woman said, her voice precise, clipped, shaped by rules Isabel didn't know. "I am Mrs. Eleanor Green, housekeeper to Mr. Rowe. You will follow me. Do not delay. He dislikes tardiness." The words struck like the toll of a clock, reminding Isabel she was no longer measured by orchard time or river time, but by the strict minutes of another man's choosing. She nodded, her throat dry. Inside, the air was cool, carrying faint notes of polish and old paper. The floor beneath her feet shone like still water. Hallways stretched long and straight, lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her, pale ancestors judging her presence. Chandeliers hung heavy, dripping with crystal light that only deepened the silence. Every surface gleamed, as though dust itself had been banished. "This household," Mrs. Green said, her heels clicking against marble, "runs on order. Breakfast is at 7 sharp, lunch at 1, dinner at 8. His study is forbidden unless summoned. His private wing is never to be entered. Loud noises are unwelcome. Doors must close softly. Shoes polished nightly. Mr. Rowe requires discretion, and discretion will be given." Each sentence fell into Isabel's ears like the snap of a lock. She tried to keep pace, but her shoes echoed too loudly, each step exposing her presence. When her fingers brushed the carved railing of a staircase, Mrs. Green's sharp glance made her withdraw instantly. "Do not touch unless instructed," the woman added, as if Isabel had already failed a test. They entered a drawing room vast enough to hold Isabel's little house twice over. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows. The fireplace stood cold and commanding, the furniture arranged with geometric precision. No cushion sagged, no book leaned from its shelf. She wondered if anyone had ever laughed in this room, or if laughter would shatter the air like glass. Mrs. Green paused. "You will wait here. Mr. Rowe will join you shortly. Sit, but properly. He notices everything." And then she left, her presence receding like the ticking of a metronome, leaving Isabel alone in silence so deep it became sound itself. She sat at the edge of a sofa, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes travelled over the room. Paintings of ships trapped in endless seas, vases filled not with flowers, but with dried arrangements that would never wilt. It was a house determined to resist time, to trap every moment in perfect stillness. Her heart pounded, loud in her chest. She thought of her father's bent shoulders, of Turner's cold smile, of her own name inked in a contract she could never undo. She thought of the man she was about to meet, the one whose silence had already been described as sacred, whose house spoke louder than any voice. A door opened, softly but with weight. Her pulse caught, then raced. She rose, her knees unsteady. The air seemed to draw in, as though the mansion itself were inhaling before a revelation. A shadow stretched across the polished floor, and in that suspended moment, before the figure appeared, Isabel wondered. Was she stepping into the safety she'd been promised, or into a silence from which she would never return? He entered the room the way dusk enters a field, quietly, with a soft authority that makes everything else fall silent. Damien Rowe was taller than the house had led her to imagine, not because she had seen his image anywhere, but because the mansion itself felt like his portrait. Austere lines, controlled light, a disciplined beauty that did not ask for applause. He wore a charcoal suit that belonged to him the way bark belongs to a tree. An inevitability, not a choice. No jewelry, no watch, nothing to catch the eye except the eyes themselves. Grey, steady, as unyielding as winter water. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was low even, the kind that lived comfortably at the end of corridors. Isabel felt the syllables brush against her skin. She inclined her head, too aware of the way her breath moved in and out. "Mr. Rowe," she replied, careful to temper her tone, making it neither timid nor bold. Her palms rested flat against her dress. She didn't fidget. She didn't look at the door. For a suspended moment, neither of them moved. The room held its breath. He took 2 steps closer, and she noticed details no portrait could give. A faint scar at his hairline, as if childhood had once tried to scribble on him and been erased. The way his shoulders carried themselves as though the bones had memorized the weight of decisions, the slight pause before he blinked, as though even that required his mind's permission. "Welcome," he said, the word edged. "I trust the journey was smooth." "It was," she answered. "Thank you for sending the car." Goodbyes that earned the smallest nod, as if gratitude were a currency he accepted but rarely traded. He gestured toward a chair across from the fireless hearth. She sat. He remained standing a moment longer, his eyes not on her face, but on her outline, as though measuring where she ended and the room began. "I imagine Mrs. Green has given you a sense of the house," he said. "She has. Order, schedules, quiet doors." Something flickered across his face, approval, perhaps, or relief that she'd been given the handbook in the right language. At last he sat. They lingered in the careful weather of strangers, factual remarks placed like stepping stones across deep water. He asked after her father. She said he was resting, that winters in the orchard were always cruel, that frost had won over fruit this year. He nodded, cataloguing the outcome rather than the story. He asked what books she read. She answered, psalms, sonnets, manuals that taught you how to mend hinges that refused to learn. His mouth softened slightly at that. "You read manuals," he said. "Most people only read the promises on the box." "Boxes lie," she replied, then flushed, afraid she had spoken too quickly. But he didn't look offended. If anything, he seemed like a man who had heard a familiar chord in an unexpected place. "They do," he agreed, letting silence sit with them as a third presence, not an enemy but a guest who knew how to listen. A tray of tea had been left behind, porcelain so fine it seemed to hold light captive. Isabel poured for both, her hands steady, mindful of Mrs. Green's warning about noise. The liquid passed from pot to cup with a softness that could be mistaken for breath. She offered sugar. He declined. He didn't ask if she wanted any, and she didn't mind. She refused as well, not from imitation, but because sweetness felt foreign this morning, as if it belonged to another world. "Mr. Rowe," she began, when the quiet had become something shaped and recognized, "may I ask you something plainly?" His eyes met hers, not challenging, not inviting, simply present. "Yes." She weighed her words carefully, as though measuring distance before a leap. "I would like to understand what you expect of me. Beyond schedules and discretion, a lesser man might have reached for platitudes, companionship, civility, partnership. He did not. He considered, and the consideration itself felt like he had opened a drawer within him to see what lived there. "Peace," he said at last. "I expect peace. I require it." He set his cup down, centered precisely on the saucer. "A house should be a sanctuary against storms that respect no roof. I have worked very hard to make this one so." A pause. "I believe you can keep it so. The fireless hearth, the tightly drawn drapes, the carpet's swallowing sound. Yes, sanctuary could also mean solitude." She let the thought pass through her like a shadow. "And from you?" she asked softly. The question cut deeper. "What should I expect?" He didn't look away. His gaze startled her with its honesty. It held caution, yes, and something sharpened by years of negotiation. But beneath it lived a space untouched, a room behind a door that had known few knocks. "I can offer you safety," he said, "respect, a life where you don't dread the mail." Her lips curved despite herself, a life without threatening envelopes. A modest promise, yet one that shook her bones with its weight. In that cold room, in that immaculate house, safety sounded like a candle not yet lit. He leaned back an inch, then forward again, his body containing a pendulum it would not let swing. When he spoke again, the voice carried a grain of confession, scraped bare of varnish. "I will be plain as well," he said. "I have no practice with certain forms of intimacy. I was not raised in rooms where tenderness was taught. If affection is a language, I was never given its grammar." Something in Isabel unclenched. He had not spoken the word, but had pointed to its outline. The air shifted, opening a narrow window through which light enters when pretense is set aside. "You will find me courteous," he continued. "I hope you will find me fair. But I cannot promise a poetry I do not yet possess. He stopped, as if meeting a cliff mid-sentence, then stepped down a harder path. "I only want to be accepted, Not for what I own, not tolerated for where I stand, accepted for who I am. The chandelier did not hum. The house offered no sound. Its silence honored the admission. Isabel's chest tightened, not with pity but recognition, the ancient ache of someone asking to exist without armor. She let her gaze rest on him, as if he were both sharp and fragile. "Thank you for saying it plainly," she said. "Most people don't." "I have little patience for pageantry," he replied. I noticed, and the slightest warmth passed between them, like two stones acknowledging they came from the same mountain. He rose and drew the curtain 2 inches, no more. Winter light entered with priestly caution. His face caught in it, showing tiredness near the temples, a jawline trained in restraint. "My father," he said into the pale light, was the kind of man who mistook fear for respect and silence for agreement. Our house had rules like this one, but they meant nothing of safety. They meant I was small when I wanted to be seen, loud when I needed to be held. I learned early that winning could be a shelter. If I was the best, I could outrun the room. He let the curtain fall without a sound and returned to his chair. "No theatrics, only facts. I have been efficient," he said. "In business, at least. I don't know how to be anything else. Efficiency where tenderness asks for waste. Time spent with no return but presence." Isabel understood that conflict the way a gardener understands drought. She saw his measured pathways, all ledger and steel, and the abandoned trails overgrown, waiting. "It isn't wrong to be efficient," she said. "It's only lonely." Silence followed. Not awkward, not cold. The hall clock marked out 4 truths before either spoke. "Miss Hart," he said at last, the formality carrying respect rather than distance, "I won't make demands you cannot grant. You will have your own rooms, your own time. Ask me anything about schedules, the staff, what this life will look like, and I'll answer." "What about what this life will feel like?" The words escaped before she could stop them, hanging in the air like a dare. He didn't flinch. "Unknown," he said, "for both of us." Mrs. Green entered then, her presence soft but precise. "Sir, the jeweler has confirmed for tomorrow. The tailor will arrive at 10. The chapel called to verify next week's booking." "All in order," he replied. The words fell like stones, solidifying time into the shape of a future. Next week. A chapel. Things meant to sound like lace, arriving as geometry. When the housekeeper left, Damien rose. "I'd like to show you the garden," he said, correcting himself a moment later. "If you wish. It isn't lively in winter, but it is orderly." "I would like that," she said. They walked side by side, steps aligned without effort. He didn't offer his arm. She didn't expect it. The conservatory door opened to a warmer air, smelling of damp earth and plants coaxed through winter. Rows of green waited beneath the glass, their color a quiet defiance against the season. He watched her face, measuring joy perhaps the way he measured revenue. "It's beautiful," she said. "Even in rest it's beautiful." "The gardener insists on cycles," he said, a trace of respect in his tone. "I trust people who insist on cycles. They understand consequence." She moved among the planters. Rosemary, thyme, lemon trees, jasmine cut back to spring's promise. A drop of condensation swelled and fell, loud in the silence. "I grew food more than flowers," she said, "but we had a rose that never quit. My mother said it was stubborn the way a heart is stubborn." He studied that, her way of tethering herself to life through stories. "Your mother is gone," he said. "Yes. Mine too. Long ago. She disappeared inside the rules." "And you?" "I built the rules. Then I lived inside them." Dale, the conservatory stretched around them, a greenhouse of controlled survival. She met his eyes. "Thank you for telling me the truth you could." He inclined his head. "If we're to build anything here that isn't pretense, truth will be our only currency." At the far end, a wrought-iron table waited, holding an untouched book. He glanced at it, then at her. "I set this here this morning. I thought of opening it, but couldn't. Perhaps I was waiting to see if you would. What is it? Keats. Sonnets. My grandmother's favourite. I've never read them. I'm not sure I know how. The unopened door again, waiting. She reached out, paused an inch above the cover. May I? Yes, he said, as if releasing air. She opened to the first sonnet. The page whispered like a moth's wing. She read 2 lines softly, then stopped, sensing he could only bear so much of that language at once. He didn't ask her to continue, and she didn't force it. The restraint between them felt like its own form of intimacy. When she closed the book, their eyes met. Something had shifted, not romance yet, not warmth, but the first line of a map between 2 points that hadn't existed before. Tomorrow will be full, he said. Arrangements, decisions, forms. Mrs. Green will show you to your rooms. Thank you. He nodded, trusting structure to hold what feelings could not. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might say more. Something small but vital, a match struck in a cave. His lips parted, then footsteps. Mrs. Green returned. Sir, Miss Hart. Damien's gaze lingered on Isabel one breath longer, as though memorizing her with Keats resting between them. He stepped back, the air cooled, and as Mrs. Green led her away through polished corridors, Isabel carried one quiet question with her. Had she just learned the shape of his solitude, or had she placed her hand on the first hidden door that, if opened, might demand everything from them both? Morning came without haste, as if the light had bargained for its right to enter the house. Winter granted a crisp kind of brightness, the sun pouring into a cold room like a letter slipped under a door. Isabel woke to a silence so complete it felt deliberate, curated. Even the radiator seemed to breathe on tiptoe. She dressed carefully, choosing a soft sweater the color of riverstone and a skirt that moved without announcing itself. The mansion had already taught her that sound was a kind of currency. Spend too much, and you were poor for the rest of the day. Mrs. Green appeared with the precision of a clock, striking the hour. Mr. Rowe is in the east veranda, she said. You may join him for tea. Do not be late. Isabel arrived a heartbeat early. The east veranda stretched like a pale ribbon along the side of the house, enclosed by panes of old glass that kept out the cold while allowing the light to lay its hands on everything. Outside, the grounds were a study in restraint. Lawns trimmed so close they looked like thought, hedges squared into obedient geometry, a fountain rising in stone like a hush turned into architecture. Frost silvered the edges of the world. A distant jay scolded the sky. Damien stood with his back half-turned, a figure framed by winter. The light made a quiet crown of his breath. On a small iron table lay the discipline of his mornings. Porcelain, a folded newspaper, a pen aligned precisely with the saucer, a single pear polished until it looked less like fruit and more like the idea of one. He heard her before he looked, but he did not startle. He never seemed surprised by others entering a room, as though he had already measured every hallway and could feel when its equation changed. Miss Hart, he said, turning the words into acknowledgement rather than ceremony. Good morning, she replied, settling into the chair opposite. The glass shielded them from the bite of winter, but the air still carried its clean mineral edge, the kind that made lungs sit up straighter. Somewhere in the background a kettle sang, then quieted Mrs. Green, curating heat. They poured tea. He took his without sugar. She did the same, now out of preference, not imitation. He set the paper aside without a rustle. The world's noise could wait. This morning belonged to 4 walls, a window, and 2 people, learning where not to step. Did you sleep? He asked, softening the word into a genuine question. I did, she said. The room listens. It helped. A corner of his mouth acknowledged the remark. I had the windows restored for that reason, he said, as if speaking about glass, but admitting by accident that silence was something he wanted reflected back at him. They spoke first of small, safe things. Jasmine pruned to patience in the conservatory. The gardener's theories of light, the way frost revealed paw prints across the lawn like notes left by ghosts. The conversation leaned on rails, steady, unhurried. But the veranda held more than their words. It held expectation, trembling like a violin string pulled taut but not yet released. Isabel wrapped her fingers around her cup. The warmth taught her palms a new language. She could feel herself arriving at a place she had been circling since her first step in his house. Not a cliff, more a threshold. Doors often masquerade as walls until you ask them to move. "Mr. Rowe," she said, then, with intent, "Damien." The smallest adjustment in his posture betrayed how the use of his name touched him. Winter light sharpened his eyes into cold water. "Yes." She kept her voice low, out of respect for the hour. "May I ask you something plainly?" He gave a slight nod, opening the space with consent alone. "Why do you not touch me?" The question fell gently, like snow, yet landed with the weight of a stone. It was not accusation, not plea. A fact offered as a bridge, and the waiting to see if he would cross. For a long breath, his face did not move. Then his jaw softened, the old bridle loosening just enough. He looked past her shoulder, through the glass to the bright, cold garden, as though the answer needed more room than the veranda could offer. "Because," he said, and the word carried a careful grief, "no one ever taught me how to make my hands safe." Her throat tightened. The confession came without theatrics, without the pride some attach to honesty. It arrived as simply as weather, delivered by a man who knew storms and had no need to embellish them. He exhaled, a measured release, and laid down each sentence like planks across a ravine. "I am 40 years old," he continued, "and I have never touched a woman in that way, not out of virtue, out of absence, from a childhood that trained me for markets and margins, that rewarded me for turning hunger into advantage. There was no grammar for tenderness where I grew up, only rules. A house filled with the sound of swallowed words." Isabel did not move. She remembered how he had once spoken of his father, using fear and respect as if they were knives pressed too close to the skin. She let silence do its work, to hold truth without rearranging it. At last his gaze rose to hers and held. "I tell you this not as excuse," he said, "but so you understand the shape of what you've stepped into. If affection is a language, I am illiterate. If it is music, I have only ever counted time." The veranda listened with him, glass, frost, iron, all attentive. The pear on the plate gleamed with unreasonable perfection. "Thank you for trusting me with that," she whispered. Something eased around his eyes. He nodded once, gratitude without flourish. "I did not want you to mistake restraint for disinterest," he said. "It isn't that. It is the fear that my hands were made for ledger lines, not for shoulders. That I might reach and break what should be cradled." Her grip on the cup loosened. "Hands learn," she said. "Even hands taught the wrong things." He glanced at his own, resting with surgical precision on either side of the saucer. "It would take patience. It would take presence," she replied. "And that you already have, just with numbers." A fleeting shadow of humor crossed his mouth before fading. "My father valued control above all. He believed touch was either possession or weakness. He taught me to shake hands like contracts, to build rooms that proved themselves without anyone inside. I lived that way, efficient, successful, impenetrable." He paused. "And then I realized I didn't know how to be held without thinking of terms." Outside, frost began to loosen. Droplets fell with tiny, bright sounds the world usually swallows. Isabel watched one form and surrender. A lesson in small surrenders. "May I ask you something in return?" he said. "You may. Why did you agree? The question chilled the air, but not cruelly, clarifying. She could have spoken of numbers, of the envelope that smelled of debt, of her father's tired bones. She could have let the word father explain everything, but the veranda, and the careful way he had placed his pen parallel to porcelain, asked for more. "Because the door you offered didn't slam," she said. "Because mercy sometimes wears a bargain's coat, and you take it even if you hate the fabric. Because I am good at tending fragile things, even when the fragile thing is only a roof. And because when I heard your name, something in me stood up, not in awe, in attention, as though a room I hadn't known decided to tidy itself for company." He watched her with acuity that felt less like scrutiny and more like fidelity to reality. His gaze softened, not a smile, but an allowance for warmth. "I do not want you to be caretaker of absence," he said, "or nurse to my deficiencies. I asked for peace. I know that is not the same as companionship. Peace," she answered, "is a good place to begin. Some houses start with parades and collapse. Some start with quiet and learn the language of opening doors." He sat with that. A ribbon of cloud crossed the sun. The room cooled, and she felt the same shift inside him, the way one braces before stepping onto an unseen surface. "I won't pretend knowledge I don't have," he said, "but I can offer attention, consent, the willingness to be taught what doesn't come naturally." His mouth flattened, not with resistance but resolve. "And I can promise you this. Any step we take will be yours to allow, not mine to demand." Her chest loosened, like a fist remembering it had fingers. "That is all I would ask." Silence wrapped the moment like warm cloth. She set her cup down. Porcelain met porcelain with the gentlest kiss. His eyes followed, not with hunger or clinical curiosity, but with the startled tenderness of a man realizing watching can itself be a form of participation. She turned to the garden. A coin of sunlight lay on the fountain's lip. Drops flashed, disappeared, flashed again. A question rose, not about vows or dates, but about the ordinary, the hours between expectation and sleep. "Would you—" She nearly laughed at herself. "Would you sit with me here sometimes with no agenda, no lists, just tea? Or not even tea?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, "and when I don't know what to say, will you let the silence stand, without fixing it?" "Yes." His answers carried the tone of a man approving plans he trusted, but underneath ran something softer, a thread drawn from a deeper spool. The veranda itself seemed to lean a fraction toward relief. She gave him the smallest smile, the kind you offer a shy animal to show the path is safe. He accepted it, placing it between them like a seed. "May I ask one more?" "You may. If I reached for your hand, would that be welcome or overwhelm?" He studied his right hand, the one that had written checks, drawn lines, and disguised denial as civility. He lifted it slightly, testing the air. His chest moved. "Welcome," he said, then softer as though the word itself was a door swung on new hinges. "Welcome." She didn't rush. She laid her palm on the iron table first, letting the cold ground her, then extended her fingers across the small distance. He met her halfway with deliberate care. His skin was warm, humanly warm. No lightning, no orchestra, just contact. Just two weathers making a climate where they touched. She kept her gaze on the garden so he would not feel examined. He looked at their hands, as if cataloguing a miracle. A tremor ran through him, not fear, not shame, but a muscle learning it no longer needed to clench. "It is only skin," she said gently, anchoring him. "For me," he whispered, "it feels as if you are touching my soul." The words traveled through her like warmth, through a house long kept cold. She turned her head then, and he didn't look away. What lived in his eyes wasn't polished. It had edges, but it also carried a daylight she had never seen there before. They stayed like that, outlined by silence, until the tea cooled to honesty. The pair remained untouched. Mrs. Green did not intrude, though Isabel suspected the housekeeper had calibrated the perimeter of this moment with the tact of long observation. Somewhere down the hall, a clock rehearsed its duty and delayed it, as if even time understood some minutes should last longer than others. When she finally withdrew her hand, it wasn't because the moment asked to end, but because beginnings are best when they aren't burdened with too much at once. He didn't hide his instinct to follow the warmth, but he didn't reach either. He let the distance stand as promise, not retreat. "There will be visitors tomorrow," he said after a while, the practical world slipping back in. Arrangements for clothing, for appearances. He grimaced at the word, as if it tasted metallic. "I'll try to keep it from becoming theatre. We will manage it," she said. He nodded, grateful for the plural. A jay landed on the fountain's rim, blue striking against the winter scale, scolded the day, then flew. They both watched, as if instructed. "Isabel," he said then, her name without title, careful and sincere. "If I do something that makes you feel small, I want you to tell me, even if you must tell me twice. I will. And if I ask for something that frightens you, I will ask gently, and we can stop." "We can stop," he repeated, practicing the phrase as if he knew he would need it often. The sun climbed an inch. The world brightened to vulnerability. She thought of the orchard, of winter's lesson that trees must stand like their own idea before spring restores their noise. She thought of his confession, the word unsaid but present, virgin, a stark, clean shape filling the air. She thought of touch, of grammar, of music counted before it can be sung. "Would you like to learn to walk the garden paths without counting steps?" she asked, lightening the moment. "It's a useful skill for men who make too many straight lines." He considered, then allowed the faintest smile. "Teach me," he said. They rose. The door sighed open, and winter slipped in like a cool hand. Gravel crunched, precise, then learned to sound like something else as their steps found an unscripted rhythm. He kept his hands in his pockets, then let them fall, then let them hang like branches at rest. She named plants asleep and plants pretending. He listened as if Latin could save him. She didn't correct his mistakes. He seemed grateful for the mercy. At the far curve of the path, where the hedge made a shy corner and the fountain spoke louder, she stopped. He stopped too, half a step behind, then corrected without apology. The sun broke free, brushing their faces with promise. She looked at him, the man trained to win, who had admitted he didn't know how to be held. He looked at her, the woman who had sold her freedom for a roof and found herself carrying a key she hadn't expected. Somewhere behind the hedge, a bird tried 3 notes and abandoned the 4th. The silence held it, waiting. She felt it too, the next thing between them, small, yet enormous. Whether to offer her arm, whether to read a sonnet aloud, or whether to let the moment remain exactly what it was. She breathed in the iron of winter water, the faint green of the conservatory drifting, the sweetness of a kitchen orange peeled with quiet care. And with frost softening into drops and the light gathering for noon, she lifted her hand slightly, not insisting, only inviting, and waited to see which path he would choose. The storm began the way sorrow begins. Quietly, with whispers no one takes seriously until the air itself is trembling. The afternoon had been calm, a sky stretched in pale grey fabric, the kind that hides its seams. But by evening the mansion seemed to sense something moving toward it. Chandeliers gave off the faintest hum, windows gathered condensation as if bracing for intrusion, and the staff hurried in muted choreography, drawing curtains, securing shutters, stacking logs by the hearths they rarely lit. Isabel stood at her bedroom window, watching clouds muscle themselves into shape on the horizon. A bruise-colored darkness gathered, the kind that looks permanent until morning proves it temporary. The trees bent in allegiance to the coming wind. The fountain sprayed high, only for its spray to be torn sideways, shredded mid-air. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and felt the first thrum of thunder echo through the bones of the house. Storms had always frightened her. As a child, she would run to her mother's lap whenever the sky turned furious, seeking arms that explained what couldn't be explained. Her father, pragmatic, called storms nothing but weather. But to Isabel, they had always felt like voices too big for the world to contain. And tonight, in this house of silence and rules, the thought of weather breaking the order made her throat tighten. Rain began in hesitant drops, ticking on the roof like a clock undecided about its tempo. Then all at once the sky opened. Sheets of water pounded the stone terrace, rattled the windows, filled the gutters with frantic rivers. Lightning cut white across the glass, and for an instant the grounds outside looked like a photograph of themselves, frozen, ghostly, stark. She pulled the curtains shut, but the storm had already moved inside her, louder than fabric could muffle. Thunder cracked, low, violent, rolling like something enormous dragging chains. Her chest heaved, each strike shaking her nerves raw. She paced her room, tried to steady her breath, reminded herself that walls stood, that roofs held. Still, her hands trembled. And then, before her mind could argue, her body decided. She slipped from her room, bare feet soundless on the carpeted corridor. She walked as though guided, her heartbeat louder than the storm, his words echoing in her memory. I only want to be accepted. Not for what I own, for who I am. She stopped at his door. Thunder rattled the window at the far end of the hall, wind pressing against the glass like a fist. She raised her hand to knock, hesitated, then let the storm do it for her. The door opened after a pause. Damien stood there, not in his immaculate suit, but in a shirt open at the collar, sleeves loose, his hair slightly disordered, as though the storm had touched him too. He looked at her without surprise, only recognition, as if he had known she would come. "The storm," she said, her voice thin. "It's—" He stepped back, wordless, granting her space before she finished. She crossed the threshold. The door shut softly behind her, muting the roar by a fraction, not erasing it. His room was large but spare, disciplined even in rest. Dark furniture, books aligned like soldiers, curtains half-drawn. Yet the air here was warmer, lived in. A fire burned low in the hearth, his concession to the night's violence. Shadows licked the walls, painting him in shifting light and dark. She stood awkwardly, hands clasped, pulse racing. He gestured toward a chair near the fire. She shook her head. "May I—" Her eyes flicked toward the edge of the bed, not with boldness, but with the honesty of fear. He considered, then nodded once. "If that is where you feel safe." She sat on the edge, posture taut, listening to the storm drum against the world. Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder so deep it seemed to rattle her ribs. She flinched, pressing her palms together. And then, hesitant, deliberate, his hand extended, palm up, resting on the blanket beside her. No words, only an offering. Her breath caught. Slowly, she laid her hand in his. Warmth met warmth. His fingers closed, not tightly but carefully, as though he understood fragility even if he had never practiced gentleness. Their hands rested together, unmoving. It was not a lover's clasp. It was something more ancient. Two humans refusing to be alone in the noise. Thunder rolled again. She squeezed his hand, and to her astonishment he squeezed back, not reflex but agreement. "It's only weather," he murmured, echoing her father's words. But in his voice they became something different. Not dismissal, but shield. "For me," she whispered, "it feels like the sky is breaking." His gaze found hers, steady even in firelight. "Then let it break here. It cannot touch you in this room." Her eyes stung, not from fear alone, but from the strange tenderness of being protected by a man who had confessed he did not know how. The fire crackled, The storm howled, and still their hands remained joined, skin learning trust through contact more powerful than words. They sat like that through the storm's tantrum, minutes stretching into hours, silence filled not with absence, but with presence. At one point she leaned her head back against the carved wood of the bed frame, eyes closing, her hand never leaving his. At another, he shifted slightly closer, not encroaching, only aligning himself with her trembling breath. Lightning lit the room once more. And in that white instant, Isabel saw not the untouchable figure the world imagined, but a man beside her. Eyes softened, hand unsure, yet unwavering. Not cold marble. Flesh touched by storms, willing to anchor her as she anchored him. Her lips moved, almost without sound. "It's just skin." His answer came low, fragile and fierce at once. "For me, it feels like you're touching my soul." Neither spoke again. The storm raged, then weakened, then wandered off to another horizon. By the time silence returned to the house, the fire had burned to embers, their hands still entwined, sleep coming. Not restless, but the rare kind that arrives when fear has finally been given a place to rest. Outside, dawn began stitching pale light into the edges of the sky. Inside, two figures sat side by side, hands joined, as if the night had rewritten the language they spoke to each other. And though the storm had passed, neither released the other's hand. Morning stitched itself back into the house, as if the night had been a seam undone, and now careful hands were repairing it. The storm had rinsed the sky clean. The world outside stood scrubbed and new, its colors washed down to their quietest truths. In the corridors, rugs lay obedient again, the air smelled faintly of hearth ash and lemon polish, and somewhere in the distance a vacuum purred, with the polite vanity of a place that preferred its silence well-groomed. Isabel woke with the peculiar peace that follows a fear not outrun but survived. The memory of his hand in hers lived in her palm, like warmth that refused to leave. No fever, no scar, only the ghost of contact that made her fingers curl, private and grateful. When she rose, she did so slowly, as if not to startle the morning. She dressed in a soft blouse and a skirt that did not argue with her steps. In the mirror, she looked like herself and also like a page already turned. On the table by the door, someone had left a small plate with 2 slices of toast and a jar of orange marmalade. Mrs. Green's apology for not approving of the weather. A note lay beside it in the housekeeper's disciplined hand. "Breakfast at 7. Mr. Rowe will be in the conservatory after." The period at the end of the sentence was as firm as a closed door. Breakfast passed like a ceremony that had finally learned how to smile. Staff moved in their usual choreography, but in their eyes Isabel read a gentle adjustment, a kind of permission, as if the house itself understood that 2 people had shared their fear and would now share their mornings. Damien arrived not late, not early, precisely on time, but with a looseness new to his frame. The night had pressed a softness into the corners of his eyes. He nodded to her and to gravity and took his seat. They spoke in the light traffic of first hours, coffee, the storm, the way a roof changes the sound of rain. He asked if she had slept. She admitted she had, eventually, and that the room had held her like a promise. He inclined his head, and the gesture carried something unpracticed and therefore precious, relief. When they walked to the conservatory, the glass still hummed faintly with the memory of wind, but the air inside was warm, the soil damp from careful hands. Plants looked brighter, as if secrets whispered by lightning had fertilized their roots. He opened the door for her, not theatrically, just the practical courtesy of 2 people learning how to share thresholds. Sunlight spilled through the panes and made medals of light on the floor. They drifted among the green. She named scents under her breath: rosemary, damp earth, a bruised citrus leaf. He didn't correct or nod like an investor. He listened with the cautious attention of a man who had discovered that the world kept a vocabulary separate from balance sheets, and wanted not to mispronounce it. Condensation beaded above them and slid down in single-file drops. Each one landed on stone with a delicate click, like punctuation. "After storms," she said, "everything smells a little like the beginning of a book." He looked at her, half smiling, the expression so shy it nearly hid behind his mouth. "And the title?" he asked. "Not yet decided," she said, letting the "not yet" stand as invitation rather than wound. At a bench where the light fell in a gentle stripe, they paused. A book lay waiting, the same slender volume he had set there yesterday and not opened. Keats, still. She touched the cover lightly, then glanced at him. He nodded. She read a few lines aloud, not to perform, but to let the words breathe. The lines moved through the conservatory like a draught finding its own path. When she stopped, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt tuned. He watched her mouth as if discovering that language had contours as well as meanings. Almost to himself he said, "I've always admired sentences that land exactly where they should. I never knew quiet could do the same." "Quiet is a place," she answered. "Most people just rush past it." He considered this as if it were something worth investing in. Then his eyes lowered to her hands, those same hands he had held when the sky was furious. She let them rest on the book's margins, not hiding, not presenting. He made no move toward them. The restraint now felt less like distance and more like reverence. "May I show you something?" she asked, and the question itself was a bridge across their different trainings. Yes. She led him to the jasmine he had admired and feared the day before. Pruned back to a promise, it looked like a tangle of pale wood, unimpressive unless you could read the future. She knelt, pointing to the sleepy nodes along the stems. "Here," she said. "They look like nothing, I know. But inside each one is a decision waiting to be made." He crouched beside her, close enough for her to feel the warmth of him without pressure. He studied the nodes with his winter-water gaze. "Decision," he repeated softly, as if trying the word on a living thing. "And what convinces them?" "Light," she said. "Time. A little warmth. Absence of panic." He nodded as though she had given him a new formula, and perhaps she had. They stayed there, knees nearly touching, their breath making a weather of its own. The conservatory doors clicked once as they settled into their frames. Under the glass, the world narrowed to stem, hand, and the possibility of bloom. When she rose, he rose with her. Something dark passed over his face, hesitation, not of desire but of history, then cleared, like a shadow rolled back by light. He reached toward a lemon branch, stopped short, and then deliberately turned the gesture into an offering. It took her a moment to realize the offering was for her. "Walk with me?" he asked, without counting steps. Of course. They left the conservatory for the gardens, where storm wash had deepened all colors. Gravel had been raked into fresh patterns, hedges glistened, their clipped edges less severe. The fountain spoke louder now, as if relieved to be voice again rather than ornament. Birds tested the air with questions. He tucked his hands into his pockets, took them out, let them fall. She noticed and didn't name it. Some freedoms arrived shyly. At a bend where the path narrowed, they drew close without intent. She felt his heat, subtle, steady, like a banked fire. His eyes moved level across her face, resting there without interrogation. He wasn't measuring her. He was seeing her. "Isabel," he said, speaking her name with an unfamiliar confidence, as though he had tried it first in private and found it fit. "May I ask you something importunate?" "You may ask anything," she said, and meant it. "If I do this wrong, will you tell me?" His voice didn't tremble, but it stepped with care. "Will you teach me?" Her heart gave one swift knock. She released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding in reserve. "Yes," she said, "we'll learn together." He stopped, and because he stopped, the world recalibrated around them. A ribbon of sunlight fell across his shoulder, softening his strict lines. He lifted a hand, slowly, clearly, and brushed with the back of his fingers a stray lock of hair from her forehead. The gesture was careful enough to be a question, natural enough to be an answer. She did not close her eyes. She let him see what his touch did, a loosening that began at her skin and unfurled inward, a yes spoken in breath and muscle. He saw. His life of reading rooms for risk had prepared him unexpectedly to read a face for permission. He didn't move closer. He waited where he was, the centimeter between them bright as wire. "May I?" he began, and left the sentence unfinished, as though the word itself should choose its own ending. "You may," she said. He leaned in, and the air between them learned new math. His mouth met hers with the restrained astonishment of first snow, soft, attentive, brief enough to respect the architecture of the moment, long enough to be undeniably real. No hunger, no tally taken, just breath meeting breath, warmth crossing borders, two cautious souls letting their caution step outside the circle and wait for them by the hedge. When they parted, the world didn't rush back. It expanded unhurried to include them standing very still on a path that had found a new direction. He looked at her as if verifying the integrity of a structure he had spent his life believing could not exist. Her throat thickened with gratitude, too deep for any word but the truth. "You didn't teach me to kiss," she said, voice steady, eyes bright. "You taught my heart to trust." The line settled between them like a coin pressed into a palm. He received it, his eyes widening, then softening with something like awe, not at himself, not at conquest, but at the existence of a language he had never believed he could speak. A small laugh escaped him, startled and genuine, sounding like a window cracked open in a long, closed room. "I was afraid," he admitted, exhaling, "that intimacy meant losing control." A beat. "I'm beginning to suspect it means choosing where to place it." "Exactly where you are," she said. "Here, with me. Or nowhere at all. There are no grades, only presence." They began to walk again, because movement felt like the right way to honor what had just breathed. Gravel shifted underfoot without complaint. He kept his hand at his side, but the space between their elbows had changed. It was no longer a border, but a field. At the fountain they paused. Coins flashed and hid in the shifting water, wishes minted by strangers sleeping at the bottom. He looked at the water with a half-smile that didn't have to pretend it wasn't working hard to exist. "I never liked those dinners," he said suddenly, the words slipping free. "The ones where men speak loudly of deals and women speak softly of nothing. I was efficient at them, hollow afterward." "You won't have to pretend with me," she said. "Not to know poetry, not to love parties, not to believe an easy lie." He nodded, and the nod felt like a signature written in breath. "I may still get lost in my habits," he warned. "Then I'll knock on the door and say, 'Come outside. It's only counting. We can come back later.' And if I am—" He searched for the word, not to dramatize, but to be exact. "Afraid." "Then I'll hold your hand," she said simply, "and we'll call it learning." He inhaled as though her words had changed the oxygen itself. A sparrow landed on the fountain, decided they were harmless, and drank. He watched with the seriousness of a man studying the physics of grace. When the sun climbed to the hour that summons work, they turned toward the house. On the veranda, Mrs. Green appeared at a tactful distance, a ledger tucked to her chest, her posture suggesting readiness wrapped in discretion. Arrangements waited, tailors, jewelers, rehearsals, the choreography of vows. The day would become practical. The world, as always, preferred lists. At the threshold, he paused. "Isabel," he said, and again her name in his mouth felt like a decision gently made. "Would you, later, walk again? Without an appointment?" "Yes," she said. "Some questions deserve quick answers, so the answer can begin its work." Mrs. Green approached with a schedule so neat it might have been printed by obedience itself. "Sir, Miss Hart, the tailor at 10, the jeweller at 2, car at 4. I confirmed the chapel rehearsal for Friday." "All in order," Damien said. But the words carried a new shade, not triumph, not duty, something closer to surrender that chooses itself. Isabel accepted the paper. The columns of times and tasks felt less like a net and more like scaffolding now. Somewhere inside the day, she knew, there would be a pocket of light wide enough for a bench, a book, and 2 people who had decided not to force what did not need forcing. As they parted for the morning's claims, their eyes met once more, a glance that held both the ordinariness of going about business and the extraordinariness of doing so after a first kiss that had asked nothing but truth. He let his hand hover near hers. No touch, just the shadow of one, an old habit bowing before a new vow. At the door of his study, something stopped him. He looked back over his shoulder, undecided courage flickering across his face, his mouth parting as though he wished to add a sentence to the day that could never fit in Mrs. Green's neat lines, a sentence still choosing its words. The invitation had arrived days earlier, delivered not on paper but in expectation. Marcus Lancaster, businessman, patron of polite cruelty, husband to Veronica, who collected pearls and whispered insults as if they were heirlooms, had decided that Damien Rowe's new arrangement warranted inspection. Of course, it wasn't phrased that way. The Lancasters rarely phrased anything so bluntly. Their letter had been a masterpiece of cordial superiority. "We would be delighted to dine together at your earliest convenience, to celebrate new beginnings and renew old friendships." In truth, it was less invitation than summons, one no man in Damien's position could easily refuse. On the evening itself, the mansion seemed to brace for battle. The chandeliers gleamed with hard polish, as though their crystals had been trained for scrutiny. Silverware was aligned to mathematical perfection, napkins folded with military precision, candles lit not for warmth, but to prove that light could be commanded. Mrs. Green moved like a conductor, ensuring every note of service appeared effortless, and yet Isabel sensed tension in the air. The faint hum of a violin string stretched too tight, awaiting the blow of a bow. She dressed with care, not extravagance, a pale gown the color of early dawn, modest, flowing, chosen not to impress, but to belong to herself. Her hair she pinned simply, leaving a few strands loose, because some rebellions are invisible to those who do not know where to look. Studying her reflection, she whispered Damien's words back to herself. "I only want to be accepted." Tonight, she resolved, she would not let him stand alone against a world that measured worth by silver and lineage. The guests arrived precisely on time, carriage wheels crunching across gravel with the entitlement of old money. Marcus Lancaster stepped inside as if the house were auditioning for his approval. Tall, broad, with a smile sharpened by success, he carried himself like a man accustomed to winning arguments before they began. Beside him, Veronica floated in, draped in wine-colored silk, her neck heavy with pearls arranged like a constellation for vanity's sake. Her perfume arrived before she did, sweet, suffocating, an overripe garden forced indoors. "Damien!" Marcus boomed, gripping his host's hand in a clasp designed to declare dominance. "It's been too long, and this must be—" His eyes slid to Isabel, pausing long enough to convey both surprise and judgment. "Your bride." Veronica's gaze swept Isabel in a single practiced motion, cataloguing the gown, the hair, the posture. Her smile appeared, brittle and gleaming. "Charming," she said with the air of someone commenting on a child's drawing. Damien's introduction was measured. "Mr. and Mrs. Lancaster, allow me to present Isabel Hart, my wife." His voice did not falter, though Isabel caught the fractional pause before wife, as though he wanted the word to land with its full weight. Dinner unfolded in a dining room that had never known ease. The table stretched long, candles trembling with each movement of silver. The first courses came in silence, staff moving like disciplined shadows. Conversation began with business, Marcus detailing his latest ventures with the confident monotony of a man who assumed interest. Damien listened, offering precise nods as if they were currency, speaking only when accuracy required it. Isabel remained composed, her hands steady, her gaze alive with curiosity she did not voice, but the moment could not be postponed forever. "So, Isabel," Veronica began, her voice smooth as cream poured over poison. "You're from... where was it again? Not the city, surely?" "The valley," Isabel answered calmly. "My family kept an orchard." "And an orchard?" Veronica repeated, savouring the word as though it were too rustic for her tongue. "How quaint!" Marcus chuckled, slicing his meat with unnecessary force. "Ro, I must say you've surprised us. I always assumed when you married it would be some heiress from the circles we know. A Lancaster, perhaps." He laughed at his own suggestion. "But instead you've chosen..." His eyes lingered on Isabel. "Something simpler." The words hit the table like dropped glass. Heat rose in Isabel's cheeks, but she held her gaze steady. She had known such dismissals before, whispers behind her back, pitying smiles at the market, but never delivered in a gilded dining room with her husband at her side. Damien set down his fork with deliberate care. Silence followed, not absence but gathering storm. He looked first at Marcus, then at Veronica, his gaze precise as a blade. "You presume much," he said, his voice calm but edged. "As though my choice requires your approval. It does not." Marcus raised his brows, feigning surprise. "Come now, Damien, no offense meant. We were only..." "You were measuring her worth," Damien cut in, sharp enough to slice the air. "And you found it lacking by the shallow scale you carry with you everywhere. Allow me to correct you." The candles seemed to lean forward. Isabel's breath caught. "Isabel," Damien continued, his voice unwavering, "is worth more than 100 women born in gilded cradles. She knows the weight of sacrifice, the language of silence, the meaning of loyalty. She carries dignity that cannot be purchased or inherited. She is not simple, she is essential." The room trembled under the force of his words. Marcus shifted in his chair, his mask of confidence cracking. Veronica's brittle smile faltered, her pearls suddenly heavy around her neck. Isabel sat frozen, her heart pounding with fierce, uncontainable rhythm. Never had anyone defended her so openly, so fiercely, with such conviction. The man beside her, who had confessed his inexperience, who had admitted his fear of intimacy, now spoke with the full power of certainty, as if his entire fortune had been built for this one declaration. "Mr. Lancaster," Damien concluded, his voice quieter now, more dangerous for its restraint, "consider the subject closed." Silence spread, heavy and absolute. The candles flickered, thunder muttered its approval in the distance, and even the staff, trained to invisibility, seemed to hold their breath. Marcus cleared his throat, muttered something about business, and steered the conversation elsewhere. But the hierarchy had shifted, the room itself had been rewritten. Isabel lowered her gaze to her plate, not out of shame, but to hide the tears threatening her eyes. Gratitude, fierce and unexpected, swelled in her chest. She stole a glance at Damien. His expression was calm again, composed, but his hand, resting on the table, had curled into a fist, as though defending her had cost him more than he would admit. Dinner continued, courses delivered, wine poured, conversation revived with difficulty. Yet the air was different now. The Lancasters' arrogance had dimmed, their laughter forced. Isabel felt it, the quiet pride humming beneath Damien's reserve, the knowledge that he had chosen not only to shield her, but to claim her, openly and without hesitation. When the evening finally ended, when the Lancasters' carriage wheels carried them away into the night, Isabel and Damien remained in the dining room, the candles burning low. She turned to him, words trembling on her lips. He met her gaze, and for a heartbeat, no explanation was needed. "Still," she whispered, her voice breaking with awe. "Why did you—" "Because you are mine to protect," he said softly. Then, after a pause that cracked something deeper open, "And because I could not let them speak a lie about the woman I—" He stopped. The word hung unfinished, suspended in the air like a bridge not yet crossed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of questions, of promises, of the fragile electric space where love begins to speak before it knows its own name. The morning after the confrontation carried a different gravity, like a landscape rinsed by storm and redrawn by a steady hand. The mansion seemed to walk on softer feet. Even the corridors, long, trained to keep secrets, felt as if they had loosened a button. Isabel moved through them with a quiet awareness that something had shifted in the architecture of her days. Damien's words at the table, sharp, clean, unhesitating, still rang in her chest like a bell whose echo takes hours to fade. She had been defended, not hidden, not excused, defended. Outside, winter gave the world a spare beauty. The horizon sat low and pale. Frost laced the hedges with filigree so delicate it looked hand-stitched. Beyond the clipped geometry and the disciplined fountain, there was a pocket of earth the gardeners barely touched, too shaded for display, too stubborn for ornament. Isabel had found it on a restless afternoon, a shy bend of the property where the land sloped into a narrow shoulder of light. It reminded her of the corners her mother used to favor in the orchard, places no one bothered to schedule. She slipped there after breakfast, a trowel hidden beneath her shawl, a packet of seeds cupped in her palm like contraband hope. The soil gave reluctantly at first, then yielded in soft clods, as though recognizing the hands of someone who had coaxed life from stubborn ground. She worked without hurry, her breath showing itself in faint clouds. The smell of damp earth rose, iron and leaf, summer stored in brown. Kneeling, she pressed seeds into the soil one by one, thyme for remembrance, basil for courage, chamomile for gentling the hours, and a row of sweet peas because beauty, too, is a duty. She planted garlic where the sun would fall longest, garlic being a promise disguised as patience. She tucked rosemary beside a stone and marked it with a ribbon salvaged from an old gift. Her fingers tingled with cold. Her chest warmed as if the ground had exhaled into it. She didn't hear him approach. Damien's steps were the kind that told a room permission before entering it. When she looked up, he stood at the edge of the patch, a dark figure against the pale light, not intervening, witnessing. He had left his jacket behind. The wind worried a strand of hair at his temple. For once, the house did not insist on his outline being perfect. "I didn't know this corner existed," he said, voice low enough not to disturb the soil. "It isn't on the plan." "That's why it's alive," she murmured, smiling. "If a place is loved only where it can be seen, it becomes a showroom. This can be a kitchen of the heart." His gaze dropped to her hands. He crouched, awkward for a moment, then steady, and pressed his fingers into the earth, as if testing whether soil would recognize hands that had mostly held pens. The cold bit him. He didn't withdraw. "What will this be?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a student. "Something to feed us when lists are louder than hunger," she said, "and something to remind us that not everything needs to be controlled." He breathed as though she had handed him a word he could stand inside. Straightening, he let a small, unpracticed smile rise at the corner of his mouth. From his coat, he drew a flat parcel wrapped in linen and tied with thread older than Mrs. Green's patience. "I came to find you," he said, "because I wanted to give you this before the day put on its armor." She stood, brushing soil from her knees. He offered the parcel with both hands, like a confession. She untied the thread, folded back the linen, and revealed a book softened by decades of palms, its corners rounded by earnest reading. Gold letters, faded but stubborn, spelled out sonnets. "It was my grandmother's," he said softly. "She read them to me when I was very small and still unguarded enough to fall asleep to language. She died when I was 9. The book was put away." He met her eyes, candid, winter-sharp and strangely gentle. "I think I was afraid that if I touched what she loved, I'd break what I remembered." Isabel stroked the spine tenderly. The leather still held his warmth. The smell, almond oil, old paper, a ghost of perfume from another century, rose like a story half told. She opened to a page marked with a pressed sprig of lavender. The paper sighed as if releasing breath. In the margin, his grandmother's pencil notes lingered. "Remember the hush in line 7. He hides the ache here. Read this slowly, Damien." Her chest tightened. "She left you a way back," Isabel said, her words a benediction. He nodded faintly. "I wanted it to belong to someone who would read it aloud in a house that isn't hostile to softness." A pause. The wind shifted a ribbon of cloud. And then, softly, in her own language, "Você mudou tudo na minha vida. Quero dividir com você as coisas que mais amo." The Portuguese fell between them like an unveiled secret, unexpected, intimate. He didn't use her language often. When he did, it was never decoration. She felt it reach the place inside her where orchard lullabies still lived. "Then let's begin," she said. They sat on the low stone bordering the patch, an altar he hadn't known he'd built. She read a sonnet, then another, her voice not theatrical but attentive. The words hung in the air, translucent and present, like breath on glass. He listened the way he had watched the jasmine, reverent, as if understanding was secondary to witness. When she reached a line where the poet turned from sorrow to appetite, she slowed, and he leaned imperceptibly closer. Even the winter birds hushed. She stopped before the end, honoring his threshold. He released a breath he hadn't known he held. "It's like a room opening in a house you thought you knew entirely," he murmured. "Rooms can be impatient with their owners," she said. They wait. Then they forgive. He looked at her hands again, soil-stained, ink-ready, stitched with practical tenderness. He didn't take them. He asked with his eyes. She turned one palm upward, permitting. He placed the book into it instead, as if to say, "Touch can begin here." Hand to page to heart and back again. They spoke of grandmothers, of the lives women lead outside the biographies men write. He told her of oranges carried in winter pockets, of geraniums on a sill, of a kitchen that felt like sanctuary. She told him of her mother's ribbons and jars, her belief that every home needed 3 things: a kettle, a Bible, and good shears. The way her laughter made walls agree to stand. Clouds thinned, the cold tightened. He didn't command the air, he adjusted around it. "We should go in," he said. "There's warmth in the conservatory." She glanced at the bed of seeds. "They'll learn the house by the sound of our voices," she said. "Let them have that." They walked back slowly, gravel softened under their steps. At the conservatory door he hesitated, not for control, but for kindness. He opened it and let her pass first, then followed, the book cradled in his arm like a fragile animal. Inside, leaves breathed green and damp. They paused by the jasmine. He touched the rim of its pot with one finger, a benediction he might deny if asked. She saw the precise way his hand learned reverence without stiffness. "Read me a line you love," he said as they settled on a bench. She chose one where love was less fever than vow. She read slowly. He closed his eyes, not in piety but calibration, as if adjusting to a new frequency. When she finished, he opened them with an expression threaded with wonder. "I've spent so long solving problems," he said. "This is not a problem." "No," she said, "it's a presence." But they slipped into a rhythm. A turned page, the soft thunk of a drop on stone, a draught whispering against the panes. He told her how patience had once outmaneuvered markets. She told him about a peach tree that only bore fruit when sung to. They let themselves sound foolish. The conservatory approved. When she closed the book, it wasn't because tenderness had run out, but because practice is better than triumph. He slid the lavender sprig back into its place, promising himself to revisit the trust it carried. "Shelves are for resting," she said, "not for hiding." A shadow crossed the glass, a housekeeper's orbit. Duty was approaching, fittings, rehearsals, vows rehearsed like theatre. He glanced at the sound, then back at her. Something in his mouth's corner suggested he might let the day's machinery run without pressing his heart into its gears. "Walk with me at dusk?" he asked. "I can have lamps lit along the south path, or none." "None," she said. "Let the dark show us what it wants." He nodded, as if taking instruction in a discipline chosen freely. He rose, offered his hand, not a command, an invitation. She set her fingers in his. The touch was brief, registering weather. Then they let go, sailors cautious with a new boat. Mrs. Green appeared in the doorway, ledger pressed to her ribs, chin at the angle of necessity. "Sir." "Miss Hart." "The tailor is ready in the blue room. The jeweller will arrive earlier than expected." Her eyes lingered on the book with respect. "Shall I arrange a case?" "Not a case," Damien said gently. "A place." "As you wish," she replied, and even her Portuguese softened the edges of formality. They moved toward the corridor, side by side, the book between them, the soil still under Isabel's nails. Mark's diamonds could not erase. At the threshold, a draught carried the faint breath of rosemary, as though the hidden garden had exhaled a blessing. The day would continue with its fittings and schedules, its measurements and mirrors, its vows rehearsed into choreography. But Isabel felt a different pulse starting in the house, the slow metronome of seeds making secret decisions beneath soil, and of a man learning to read a grammar the world had taught him to mistrust. And as they turned the corner toward the blue room, where pins glinted like spears and tape measures coiled like tamed snakes, Isabel glanced at Damien, caught him glancing back, and saw in his eyes the spark of an unfinished question, as if he were about to ask which sonnet might be theirs, or whether rosemary should be moved closer to light, or if perhaps there was a word she could lend him to name how the day's noise was beginning to sound less like command and more like accompaniment. The tailor and jeweller had come and gone, leaving behind their pins, polished smiles and measurements wrapped in velvet words. The afternoon dissolved into a haze of appointments, fabric swatches laid against her skin, rings glittering beneath careful lamps, signatures placed on forms that turned the private into public record. Isabel endured it all with composure, Damien beside her, patient, silent, uncomplaining. Yet beneath the routine hum of preparations, something quieter beat between them, steady and insistent. The memory of the confrontation at dinner, the hidden garden they had shared, and the fragile courage of a hand offered in the storm. When dusk descended, the house exhaled. Staff withdrew into their corners, corridors fell silent, and the sky deepened into indigo stitched with stars. Isabel felt herself drawn to the gardens, craving cool air, the fountain's voice, the freedom of a world not choreographed by ledgers and appointments. She slipped outside, shawl around her shoulders, her steps soft on gravel paths, still fragrant with rain. The jasmine, pruned back, waited in patient silence. Lanterns had been left unlit as she had asked. Darkness pressed close, but it was a tender dark, the kind that lets honesty slip past fear. The fountain murmured in the distance, water throwing silver into the air before swallowing it again. She was not surprised to find Damien already there, standing near the hedge where the path curved. His presence felt less like arrival and more like inevitability. He turned when he heard her, the line of his face softened by starlight. "I thought you might come," he said. "I thought you might wait," she answered. They walked side by side, unhurried. The gravel crunched softly beneath their feet, a rhythm almost like breath. The night air smelled of damp stone and rosemary, the perfume of beginnings. They spoke little at first. He asked if the day had tired her. She said the fittings had been heavy, not for the fabric, but for the weight of being measured as if love were a garment. He listened, his silence full of attention. She asked if business had pressed him. He admitted he had postponed meetings, unashamed of the reprieve. At the far end of the path, where the hedge opened into an alcove, they stopped. A bench waited there, wrought iron curling into patterns that caught the faint starlight. They sat, leaving space between them, though the space felt charged with a question. Damien rested his hands on his knees, clasped them, then let them fall, as if rehearsing what still felt new. At last his gaze turned to her, steady, unflinching, though his voice carried the vulnerability of a man unaccustomed to asking. "Isabel," he said, her name careful as prayer, may I ask permission?" She tilted her head, breath caught between fear and anticipation. "Permission for what?" His eyes held hers, pale and clear, but beneath them a tide moved. "To kiss you. Not because of a contract, not because of appearances, but because I wish to." The night seemed to pause. The fountain's murmur grew louder, the hedges stilled, and even the stars leaned in. Isabel's chest tightened, not with dread, but with an ache that felt like release. She had not expected the question, nor the way he framed it, not as entitlement, but as a request that placed her in command of the moment. She nodded slowly, her throat too tight for words. "Yes," she whispered. He did not rush. His hand lifted, hovered near her cheek as if asking a second permission. When she leaned toward the space, his fingers brushed her skin, warm, hesitant, reverent. Then he leaned closer, his breath mingling with hers, his lips meeting hers with a tenderness so deliberate it stung her eyes. The kiss was not urgent. It was careful, patient, the meeting of two solitudes that had chosen together not to remain solitary. There was no hunger to conquer, no demand to consume, only presence, trust, and the wonder of discovery. His lips trembled slightly against hers, and she realized, with a rush of fierce affection, that he was as frightened as he was devoted. When he drew back, it was only the smallest distance, enough to see her eyes, enough to make the silence between them sacred. His voice came low, almost breaking. "You have surpassed every expectation," he said, "every single one." She smiled, tears burning at the edges of her vision. "You didn't have to expect anything," she whispered, "only to be here." The night closed gently around them, like a book marking a chapter, not with a period, but with a comma. They sat in silence, the bench steady beneath them, the fountain's voice keeping time, the stars approving without comment. His hand found hers again, less hesitant this time, as if the kiss had taught him what words could not. They stayed until the air grew colder, until the house lights flickered in the distance, until silence had given them everything it could. Then they rose together, the path carrying them back not as strangers bound by contract, but as two hearts, hesitant yet willing, learning that love does not always arrive with fanfare. It can grow like a seed, slow, steady, inevitable. And as they reached the steps, the echo of that kiss lingered, fragile yet fierce, the kind of memory that promises it will bloom again. The days that followed carried the rhythm of a house learning to breathe differently. The mansion, once a museum of silence, now seemed to soften at the edges. Doors no longer groaned under restraint, curtains let in more light, and even the staff, discreet as ever, moved with a gentleness that suggested they had noticed the quiet recalibration between their master and his bride. For Isabel, each morning felt less like an imposition and more like an invitation. The secret garden she had planted pushed tender shoots through the earth, a rebellion against perfection. She visited daily, pressing her fingers into the soil, whispering to the seeds as if they were confidants. Damien often joined her, not always speaking, sometimes only standing nearby, his presence no longer cold stone but steady ground. And yet, beneath the calm, something gathered, not tension, not fear, but anticipation, an invisible tide waiting to declare itself. Isabel sensed it in Damien, how he lingered at thresholds as if weighing words, how his gaze rested on her face, not with hunger, but with searching tenderness, how his hand once or twice brushed hers deliberately, rehearsing courage. A decision was forming in him, one that no ledger could measure, no contract could secure. The moment came on a weekend when frost still rimmed the mornings, but the afternoons hinted at promise. He asked her to accompany him beyond the mansion grounds, to a place he had not visited in years. A carriage waited, simpler than his usual cars, its wheels crunching over gravel like a song remembered. The road climbed, leaving behind manicured gardens, stone gates, and silence trained into obedience. They entered the hills where the air grew sharper. Pines etched themselves against a pale sky, and streams broke free from their ice with spring's insistence. After an hour, they reached a small lodge tucked into a mountainside. Unlike the mansion, it carried no grandeur, its wooden walls weathered by seasons, its windows fogged by winters past, its porch content with dust. "This is where my mother brought me," Damien said quietly, helping her down, "the only place I remember her laughing." The lodge smelled of pine and smoke, as if the air itself remembered every fire ever lit in its hearth. Inside, the walls were plain, the furniture worn but honest, cushions that invited sitting, shelves of old books with cracked spines, mugs chipped but still in service. Isabel felt the room welcome her in a way the mansion never had. They spent the afternoon walking narrow trails. Snow lingered in shaded corners, birds tested the air with early calls. Isabel gathered sprigs of evergreen and tucked them into her shawl. Damien spoke little, but his silence was no longer guarded. It was open, as though he'd stopped keeping her outside the door of himself. At dusk, they returned to the lodge. He lit a fire, flames spilling golden light across the wooden walls. Isabel sat near it, her cheeks flushed, shawl drawn close. She watched him pace once, twice, then stop. His hands flexed as if they longed to hold something too fragile for strength alone. Finally, he came to her. "Isabel," he said, her name a prayer. From his pocket, he drew a small box, not new, its velvet softened by time. Inside lay a ring, modest, radiant, not with wealth, but with memory, gold worn smooth by years, a diamond steady, but unassuming. "It was my grandmother's," he said, voice unsteady, "the only woman who ever showed me tenderness before you." He lowered himself to one knee, not in performance, but in raw sincerity that stung Isabel's eyes. "I once asked you to marry me with paper and silence. I signed away your freedom with my fear. Tonight I ask again, not as a transaction, not out of necessity, but as love, real, chosen, free." His gaze held hers, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "Isabel Hart, will you marry me again, this time because my heart belongs to you, not to silence?" Her breath caught. The fire cracked, the mountain wind pressed at the windows, the world held still. She looked at him, the man who had seemed untouchable marble, now kneeling, trembling not from weakness but from devotion. Tears blurred her vision. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Damien. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been waiting. When he rose, she reached for him, and their embrace carried no hesitation, only the certainty of two lives weaving into one fabric. "You freed me," he murmured into her hair. "From every chain I forged myself." "And you," she answered, pressing her cheek to his chest, "gave me a home that is not walls, but your heart." Outside, stars burned cold above the mountain. Inside, before the fire, two souls chose each other, not by necessity, but by love, born in patience, grown in trust, and sealed in freedom. Morning in the village did not arrive. It unfurled, soft as a hymn hummed behind a closed door. The chapel stood at the end of a lane where the pavement surrendered to packed earth, where hedges let children hide, and where wind carried the smell of bread cooling on a sill. Its stones were old enough to remember names no one spoke anymore. But the bell was new, donated by someone who loved how sound can polish an hour. Sunlight touched the steeple first, then slid down into the stained glass. Blues so deep they felt drinkable. Reds warm as fruit. Birds perched along the gutters. A dog slept under the steps like a deputized witness. Isabel crossed the lane, wearing a dress that was not expensive, only right. It had been sewn by women who measured with memory, who pinned while telling stories, who tucked a secret ribbon where only love would find it. The fabric, off-white with a whisper of cream, fell as though gravity adored it. The hem brushed dust that had known her as a girl. It gathered nothing but blessing. Her hair was gathered low, a sprig of rosemary pinned above her ear, remembrance and courage in a green line. She carried no bouquet. The chapel already held every flower she needed. Wild jasmine slipped into a jar, winter berries threaded along the pews like punctuation, eucalyptus releasing a clean, faithful scent. The village had come, not in parade, but in gentle accumulation. Neighbors slipped through the door 2 by 2, their voices softened by scarves and shared history. Old men who had once carved benches now sat on them, marveling that wood can outlast worry. Women who had taught Isabel to sew and to say thank you reached out to squeeze her fingers as she passed, pressing blessings into her skin as if love could be absorbed like oil. Children tiptoed and failed, their eyes wide, unafraid of joy. A small choir tuned itself the way a flock aligns, by listening sideways, by trusting a note when it appears. Thomas Hart stood near the front row, better dressed than he had any right to be, a borrowed suit, a tie rescued from decades past. He had shaved with care and nicked himself twice, honest marks of a man still trying. His eyes were wet already. When he saw his daughter framed in the chapel door, his mouth opened in a silent prayer that was apology, astonishment, and praise at once. He did not wipe his tears. He let them speak. Damien arrived without spectacle, as if the road had chosen to deliver him. He wore a suit the color of slate after rain, precise in cut, but softened by a tie that had belonged to his grandfather, plain navy, a single crooked stitch making it human. At his lapel, a small pin shaped like a lemon leaf, his quiet insistence that the conservatory be remembered. When he entered, sound adjusted itself around him. The choir's hum cooled, conversation dropped a key. He paused at the threshold, not for admiration, but to drink in the sight like water. His gaze found Thomas first. The two men exchanged a nod, an agreement signed without ink. We failed, we tried, we arrived. Then Damien's eyes found Isabel. The world narrowed, not by command, but by consent. Everything else, the stained glass, the eucalyptus, the cough from the third pew, fell away. She stood there with mourning stitched into her, a bride whose dress made the word feel less like theatre and more like vocation. The ache behind his ribs loosened. The ground steadied beneath him. He took one breath to mark the moment, another to belong to it. Mrs. Green stood 4 rows from the back, overseeing as always. She had even permitted herself a hat, stern, elegant, faintly perfumed with starch. If anyone had told her a year ago she'd be watching her employer marry a woman whose hands carried soil beneath their nails like jewelry, she'd have dismissed it as sentiment. Now, she tightened her mouth against tears. The ledger of her heart had added 2 columns. The minister, a woman with kind shoulders and a voice that carried without strain, welcomed them. "We are not here for spectacle," she said, and the chapel exhaled. We are here because two people have chosen each other, and because choosing is a holy verb. Music rose, not grand, not timid, simply sufficient. Isabel walked the aisle alone by design. She met eyes as she passed, accepted their love, returned it. At the front, she turned to Damien. The space between them was brief and weightless, like the pause before a word. Their vows were not poetry. They were truth. And truth, spoken aloud in a room trained to hold it, becomes its own music. He went first. I cannot promise a life without storms. I cannot promise I will never retreat into the rooms I built to survive. But I promise I will invite you in. I promise to tell the truth before it has to be dragged out. I promise to touch your hand on purpose. I promise to choose you when it is easy and when it is costly, when I am strong and when I am not. I will protect your peace without silencing your voice. I will build days with windows. Her chest trembled. She held his gaze and answered, I cannot promise I will always be brave, but I will walk toward fear with you. I will not keep score of wrongs no one wins by remembering. I will remind you that efficiency is not love, that time spent is not wasted. I will bring green things into rooms that have forgotten how to breathe. I will tell you when you make me small and forgive you when you learn to stop. I will choose the quiet with you, and I will sing when quiet becomes a prison. I will plant, I will harvest, and I will leave corners unplanned so grace can find us. Silence held them while the vows settled. Somewhere, a baby cooed. The minister smiled, relieved by people meaning what they said. The rings waited on a small dish. A circle of beaten gold for her, imperfect in ways light adored, a simple band for him, unadorned, proof that not every treasure must shout. When he slid her ring on, his hands trembled, not with fear but with honesty. When she returned the gesture, her touch grazed his knuckle, and he inhaled as if a door inside him had swung toward light. By the witnesses here, the minister said, by the vows spoken, by the goodness that visits even those who least expect it, I pronounce you partners in life, keepers of one another's peace. She did not instruct him to kiss his bride. She simply waited. Damien touched Isabel's cheek first, the new ritual of asking. She leaned into it. Consent, warmth. The kiss that followed was not for the room, but for the two who had practiced courage in increments, who had chosen presence over performance. The chapel received it like bread. Applause followed. Not brittle applause of society, but the round clapping of neighbors who had baked casseroles, folded chairs, and buried spouses. Thomas laughed through tears. A child shouted, "Hooray!" Mrs. Green allowed herself exactly 4 discreet claps. They walked back down the aisle together, not floating, not marching, simply moving in one direction at the same pace. Outside, rosemary and olive leaves rained over them like prayers. The dog under the steps woke, wagged once, and slept again. The feast was held on the green. Tables covered with white cloths bore bread, soups, pies, cider in jars, raspberries rescued from frost. A fiddler coaxed old tunes back to life. People laughed, sang, teased, blessed. Isabel moved among them as neighbor, not spectacle. Damien carried chairs, fetched cider, let an old woman fix his tie. He was teased by boys, and he laughed. When thanked for repairing the chapel roof, he said, "The roof was only accounting. What matters is the peace it shelters." People liked him for that. He liked himself for saying it. As gold light settled on the day, Isabel and Damien slipped aside into the hedge's privacy. The ring on her finger shone like a humble star. His hand found hers. No words. Language had worked hard. They stood together listening to the choir's fading song, watching children run. "I thought I would feel finished," she said softly. "But I don't. I feel begun." He nodded. "We built vows. Now we must live them into rooms." She smiled. "And if the hinges stick, we'll oil them with marmalade." He laughed, startled by her plain poetry. Thomas approached, offering a photo of Isabel's mother, young and stubbornly beautiful in an orchard. She would be feverish with joy, he said. Isabel touched the photo's edge. "Thank you," she whispered, to both of them. When evening cooled the air, goodbyes stretched into anecdotes. The chapel door was pulled to, but not locked. The car waited. Isabel took a last look at the stained glass, the bell, the steps, the scent of eucalyptus. She climbed in beside Damien. The road carried them home under patient stars. In the car's quiet, their fingers found each other again, practiced now, gratefully unremarkable. He glanced at her. "I promised windows. Tomorrow may we open one we've kept closed." "Tomorrow," she said. The mansion lights rose ahead, its conservatory catching the moon. They sat a moment longer before stepping out, holding the day between them like a loaf of bread, still warm, not yet cut, the next slice theirs to decide. 6 months had passed since the little chapel had held their promises. Time was no longer measured in contracts or obligations, but in harvests, in mornings that entered freely through open windows, in steps taken side by side along corridors that had learned a new music. The mansion, once a cathedral of silence, no longer echoed hollow. It was filled with breath, with quiet laughter, with conversations paused only so that a glance could finish the sentence. In the secret garden, Isabel's hidden patch, grown in the shadow of walls no one else visited, life burst forth in colors and fragrance. Rosemary grew strong, jasmine threaded its perfume into the air, and the herbs, timid at first, now rose like small monuments of perseverance. Damien walked beside her, his hands no longer tense, accustomed now to the simple gesture of being laced with hers. It was harvest season. Wicker baskets filled with ripe tomatoes, fresh herbs and small fruits that seemed to carry the purest metaphor. What is planted with care blooms. What is watered with patience returns sweetness. Isabel knelt in the soil, her skirt marked green, while Damien, who had once feared staining his hands with anything other than ink, now shared in the joy of pulling roots from the ground as though they were trophies. The field echoed with simple sounds, wind stirring through leaves, the distant call of geese, the occasional laugh of a neighbor who had come to help, and within this scene stripped of ostentation there was a grandeur no high society dining hall could ever offer. Isabel looked at Damien and saw not the millionaire bound by rules and shadows, but a man with soil on his hands and eyes lit with a nearly childlike contentment. And Damien, in turn, saw not the young woman once forced to sign a contract, but the woman who had given him the courage to begin again. "When I signed that paper," Isabel murmured, holding a branch of basil, "I thought I was selling my freedom." Damien set the basket down and stepped closer. His eyes reflected the sunset gilding the sky. "And I," he said quietly, "thought I was buying peace. But I've learned peace can't be bought. It's born when we allow ourselves to be found." They stayed there, between rows of plants, wrapped in a quiet that was not absence but presence. Their love was no longer a prison, but a choice. No longer a contract, but a harvest. No longer an imposed silence, but a dialogue made free. And as the last light of day melted into the horizon, Isabel thought, "I signed a contract. But in the end, I also signed the new beginning my heart was asking for." Damien, as if he had heard her thought, took her hand with calm certainty. There was no fear left in the gesture, only gratitude. The future did not promise the absence of storms, but now they knew they could face them together. And freedom, cultivated among seeds and sonnets, had become the home where both, at last, belonged.